Good morning, everyone. I'm Barbara Vanich, Chief Auditor and Director of Professional Standards at the PCAOB, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. I would like to welcome you to this meeting of the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. This morning, I want to welcome our members, observers, board members, and the public watching this meeting. Thank you for your time over the summer, members. I appreciate the insights you shared with me. I hope you noticed some of your suggestions being taken into account at this meeting and at future meetings. At our last meeting, we spent most of the day talking about fraud. Thank you for your input at that meeting. Since that meeting, the Emerging Issues Subcommittee updated their recommendations to include your input and shared those recommendations with the board. And the staff are considering those recommendations in our project on the fraud standard. We've also been considering your input on the interim internal audit standard, and thank you for that input at the last meeting. We have a full agenda today. First, Chair Williams will make a few remarks, then I'll provide a brief standard setting update that includes an overview of projects finalized by the board since your last meeting. I will also call on Jeff Mahoney to provide you with a brief update on the Investor Advisory Group selection of critical audit matters among those submitted. After that, we plan to devote a good portion of our meeting today to technology, which was a theme that many of you expressed interest in. First, the staff will talk about specific technology requirements that exist today, and later the Emerging Issues Subcommittee will preside over a discussion on generative AI. And lastly, we seek your input on several other interim standards related to subsequent events. I'd like to thank Preeti, Brian, David, Jim, and Dane for all their work in preparing for today's discussion, along with the staff presenters. I look forward to the report back after lunch on our breakout sessions. We've built in time for commentary throughout the meeting. As a reminder, if you'd like to say something, please use the raise your hand function, and we'll try to call on you in the order your hand was raised. Please stay on mute if you're not speaking, and please reach out to Will DeSantiago or Brian Goodnaw if you have technical issues. Thank you in advance for your patience. And now my final responsibility here, although others may repeat it, is to state that for all representatives of the PCAOB speaking at this meeting, our remarks are provided in our official capacity, and the views expressed are those of the speaker, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent views of the board, board members, or other members of the staff. As mentioned, Chair Williams has some opening remarks. If you don't mind, please hold any questions until after the standard setting update. Chair Williams?
Thank you, Barb, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group meeting. It is wonderful to be with you virtually today. Before we begin, I'm also going to provide the usual disclaimer that the views I express here are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of my fellow board members or the PCAOB staff. I want to again begin today by thanking you all for your feedback and insights that were shared during our last meeting in May, especially about the especially concerning the discussion about fraud. Fraud is something we look at comprehensively at the PCAOB, as our standards require the auditor to consider fraud throughout the course of the audit, from the earliest stages of planning an audit all the way to evaluating the audit results to determine whether the audit evidence obtained is sufficient and appropriate to support the opinion to be expressed in the auditor's report. I know this is an ongoing topic for the SEAG too, and I appreciate the insights you shared at our last meeting. In general, fraud continues to be a midterm project on our standard setting agenda. Recently, we developed a fraud risk resource page on our website to centralize and highlight important information for auditors and others. Specifically, it provides materials on our standards, PCAOB and SEC staff guidance, relevant enforcement actions, information on our tip line, as well as many other resources. And it is designed to be a living, breathing resource for users as we continue to update it. Meanwhile, the PCAOB continues to explore how we can be a collaborative resource for firms and investors alike to deter and identify fraud while we consider potential changes to our fraud standard, AS 2401, including better aligning the auditor responsibilities related to fraud with the auditor's risk assessment procedures. I look forward to continuing our conversations on that topic. Since we last met in the spring, we continue to make progress against the three pillars within our strategic plan. I'll briefly touch on the latest highlights since we last met, beginning with our standard setting projects. Under this board, the PCAOB has issued proposals for 10 standard setting and rulemaking projects and finalized 6. Including 4 since the last SEAG meeting in May: Quality Control, AS1000, Technology Assisted Analysis, and Rule 3502, which deals with contributory liability. Nearly all of these had not been updated in decades. Barb will go over this work in detail shortly, so I don't want to repeat what she's about to say, but I do want to take this opportunity to thank the SEAG for your feedback on our agenda and individual projects. The number of standard setting and rulemaking projects on our agenda is ambitious. And although, as I just mentioned, we have made significant progress, significant work lies ahead. We recently updated our standard setting and rulemaking agenda, which makes clear our priorities for short-term and mid-term projects. Our expert staff are diligently working on proposals or adoptions as the case may be, and they will move forward with recommendations to the board when they are ready for the board's consideration. The agenda is intended to be dynamic and we are committed to getting it done, but I want to emphasize that in every project, our goal is not to rush, rather it is to get it right and to fulfill our investor protection mandate. Our mission to protect investors is why, ahead of the effective dates for these finalized standards, we are committed to providing firms with resources to help them update their methodologies and train their staff on the upcoming changes. For example, with the implementation date for our new QC standard set for the end of next year, we recently published a practice aid that outlines the changes to the standard that may go beyond the provisions of other standard setters' quality control standards. This aid is meant to assist a firm in building upon their existing QC system to ultimately have a QC system that complies with PCAOB standards as well as the quality control standards of others. We also recently added to our website a knowledge check quiz for users to test their understanding of the new standard AS1000. Upon submitting responses, the tool provides participants with their results, including why an incorrect response was wrong. Our goal in issuing these materials is to make sure firms are familiar with the changes so auditors know what to do when the requirements become effective. And we want feedback on these materials. We want to know if you prefer one of these resources over the other, or if you think additional materials are necessary. Firms can also reach out to us with questions by talking with our inspectors while they are in the field, initiating a standards-related inquiry through our standards website, or by simply giving us a call via the number that can also be found on that website. Put simply, the PCAOB is here to help firms be successful as they implement these standards and as the implementation date gets closer. And we hope they take advantage of this time to prepare. Because if firms are prepared, knowledgeable, and ultimately successful, then investors are better protected. But I want to be clear, while the PCAOB wants to be as helpful as we can, preparing for implementation is the firm's responsibility. Moving on to our inspections program. Since we last met, the PCAOB completed fieldwork on its first inspection ever in mainland China. This action builds on the progress made in 2022, when thanks to the work of Congress through the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, the PCAOB secured historic access to inspect and investigate firms headquartered in mainland China and Hong Kong. We have used our access already to deliver historic sanctions holding China-based firms accountable, and we will continue to demand complete access, no loopholes, and no exceptions. Regarding our inspection reports, since we last met, we released the 2023 reports. For annually inspected firms, the reports were published 6 months faster than last year, and nearly all of the reports for triennially inspected firms were published within 6 months of the completion of those inspections. I am incredibly proud of our staff's work to get this information into the hands of investors and other stakeholders as quickly as possible, especially as in recent years, the PCAOB has found that audit deficiencies, particularly Part 1A deficiencies, are unacceptably high. This troubling trend cannot be overstated. Part 1A deficiencies mean the audit firm failed to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence to support its opinion, and audit opinions were signed without completing the audit work required to verify the accuracy of the financial statements. These deficiencies include things like failing to perform any procedures at all to test revenue or the cost of inventory, as well as instances where the auditor did not identify and test any controls over long-lived assets and depreciation expense. Simply put, Part 1A deficiencies are not just serious, they go to the heart of the audit. That's why we have been focused on reporting Part 1A deficiencies and other information to provide investors, audit committees, and other stakeholders with key pieces of information to assist them in assessing the work of their audit firm. The PCAOB will continue demanding firms do better and deliver the high quality audits that investors deserve. For our role in educating the market, the PCAOB is constantly seeking out new avenues to inform the investors and the public at large about our work. Just to name a few examples today, we expanded the tools available on our website to make it easier to find and compare deficiency rates across audit firms. We regularly publish investor bulletins and advisories, which are specifically designed to help keep investors informed of the PCAOB's activities and observations. And we met with more than 200 audit committee chairs and provided audit committees with specific questions they should ask of their auditors. Additionally, we sent audit committee chairs who have participated in our audit committee chair dialogues the most recent inspection report of the firm that audited the company where they serve on the audit committee. Each of these examples plays a part in helping to improve audit quality and meet our mission of protecting investors. Finally, under this board, we are expanding how we identify cases and are making sanctions count. The PCAOB issued approximately $35 million in fines this year alone. We've also required functional changes to a firm's supervisory structure for the very first time, and we've required firms to retain an independent monitor to drive improvements and best protect investors. Enforcement has been a critical tool at our disposal, and we focus on cases that involve serious matters that put investors at risk. Audit failures in cases involving financial statement fraud, taking on client work that firms can't complete, altering work papers, and not performing sufficient work before signing audit opinions. We examine the facts and circumstances of every case and have not hesitated to impose bars on bad actors, revoke firms' registrations, and impose civil monetary penalties, among many other options on the table under this board. These are, of course, just some examples of the serious sanctions that this board has imposed in the name of investor protection. But all of the actions taken by this board send the message loud and clear. If you put investors at risk, you will be held accountable. I know we have a lot of ground to cover today, so I'll keep this short and stop there. I'm looking forward to today's meeting and the opportunity to listen to and learn from each of you, especially on the ever-changing topic of technology. This is something we are obviously watching very closely. Our staff who are working on the data and technology project on our research agenda are supported by experts with significant knowledge of this area from within our Office of Economic and Risk Analysis and our Office of Technology. These individuals are at the forefront of the latest developments at the nexus of technology, innovation, and audit quality. And we continue to look for opportunities to leverage their vast knowledge as well as the expertise of our external partners when discussing the impact of emerging technologies on audit quality. We look forward to sharing more information on our efforts when we can. Additionally, you may have seen that cybersecurity was a panel topic at our recent IAG meeting in September. And if you haven't already, I suggest watching the recording of the meeting, which can be found on our website. Again, thank you to the SEAC for your work putting together today's program, and of course, all the feedback and insights you provide us with on an ongoing basis. I also want to take a moment to especially thank the Emerging Issues and Auditing Subcommittee for setting the stage for a robust discussion today. I apologize that my technology is not working well today and my video froze, but I wanted this thank you and turn this back over to Barb.
Thank you, Chair Williams. So I'll use the rest of our time this morning just to fill in some of the details on some of the matters that Erica touched on, and I'll give Brian a moment to get the slides up. And you can advance to the slide 3. There we go. So at the beginning of this month, we updated the anticipated timing for board action on several projects on our short-term agenda. In what remains of this year, we anticipate making recommendations that the board adopt a new standard on noncompliance with laws and regulations, new rules on registration, firm reporting, um, and firm engagement metrics. We also anticipate that recommending that the board propose to replace several of the interim standards that address auditor reporting in specific circumstances. Turning to 2025, we anticipate making a recommendation that the board adopt a new standard on substantive analytical procedures. We also anticipate making a recommendation that the board issue proposals on going concern, our attestation standards, and on inventory. Our recommendation on inventory will take into account SEAG member input from last fall. If you would advance the slides, Brian. We added a project on several interim standards that address subsequent events and other matters that arise after the date of the auditor's report to the midterm agenda. And like other midterm agendas, we don't anticipate board action in the next 12 months. However, we're actively working on the project and we're looking forward to your input on that later today. We're interested in your input today for both sections on technology, both the more current discussion first, and then what I'd refer to as the more forward-looking discussion on AI, as that will inform our research project on data and technology. And at the end of my remarks, I'd like to turn to Jeff Mahoney for an update on the IAG's selection of critical audit matters. As you might recall at our last meeting, I mentioned that the IAG was seeking nominations from the public for the most decision-useful critical audit matters or key audit matters contained in public company audit reports included in the 2023 filings. Could advance the slide, Brian. In June, the board proposed to replace the existing standard on substantive analytical procedures, AS 2305, which was put in place by the AICPA in 1989 and adopted by the board in 2003. The existing standard predates the risk assessment standards and also advancements in technology and greater availability of information that we understand are influencing current practice. The proposed standard would strengthen and clarify the auditor's responsibilities for performing substantive analytical procedures and address risks specifically associated with the use of technology-assisted analysis in SAPs. You may recall we discussed this with you back in March 2023, and as I just mentioned, we hope to recommend that the board adopt a new standard on substantive analytical procedures in 2025. Next slide, Brian. So turning to board standard setting activities, as Erica mentioned, since the last SEAG meeting, the board adopted QC 1000, our new quality control standard, AS 1000, the new standard on auditors' general responsibilities. The board also adopted the amendments related to aspects of designing and performing audit procedures that involve technology-assisted analysis of information in electronic form, which I will refer to after this as the data amendments. And lastly, the board adopted Rule 3502 on contributory liability. Next slide. So let's start with AS 1000. AS 1000 is an important standard as it governs the fundamental responsibilities of the auditor including independence, training and proficiency, due professional care, and professional skepticism. As part of this project, certain other projects were amended, although except for the documentation completion date, they really don't change existing requirements. The first set of amendments mentioned on this slide rescinds an interim standard that discussed the auditor's evaluation of whether the financial statements were presented fairly. These requirements were moved to another standard that deals with the evaluation of audit results, and we believe that reduces duplication and makes the standards easier to follow and understand. The next set of amendments also did not change any existing responsibilities, as the standards already require the engagement partners responsible for the engagement, but it adds some detail on what that's intended to encompass. And it was based on that our standard on engagement quality review includes quite a bit of detail as to who a reviewer can be and what a reviewer has to look at, but really contained very little detail on what an engagement partner has to do, even though they're responsible for the engagement. And so, for example, we added a requirement specifically to review documentation of significant findings or issues, that the engagement partner should also review the documentation that's required to be provided to the engagement quality reviewer, and that this review has to be completed prior to the report release date. And the last bullet does describe a change in existing requirements, which is to accelerate the documentation completion date from 45 days to 14 days. And what that relates to is the requirement for the auditor to assemble, after the report has been issued, a complete set of work papers, and that will represent a change. Now, if you could advance the slide, Brian. Except for the documentation completion date requirement, the updates will take effect for audits of financial statements for fiscal years beginning on or after December 15th, 2024. But with respect to the documentation completion date, smaller firms will have an additional year until that requirement becomes effective. As Erica mentioned, we developed a self-grading quiz that we posted to the AS1000 implementation page. Currently, we don't anticipate issuing any additional guidance, as we've not received any questions yet, but we always leave that line of communication open just in case. So moving on to the quality control standard, QC 1000 is a significant rulemaking, and the QC system is the foundation of the audit practice of every firm. And the new standard will have an effect on all firms that are registered with the PCAOB, even those that don't perform any audits. The new QC 1000 sets forth quality objectives for the components of the QC system. It requires the firm to annually assess quality risks and develop corresponding quality responses. It also includes some specific quality responses. As you know, before the PCAOB adopted QC 1000, the IAASB and the ASB issued their own quality management standards. The good news is that firms can leverage the work they've already completed and the investments they've already made to comply with those standards. These other standards informed our thinking when developing QC 1000, and so the structure of the standards have a lot of commonalities. Importantly, like other quality management standards, QC 1000 is risk-based and therefore scalable. But QC 1000 also has alternative and incremental provisions that the PCAOB designed to better serve investors and the public interest for PCAOB registered firms. And so just a few examples that I'll highlight is our QC 1000 specifically addresses other participants in the audit. And that would include firm specialists, external specialists, other firms, or third-party providers. There are more specific requirements for monitoring and remediation and the evaluation of the QC system. It won't surprise you that the ethics and independence component is aligned with SEC and PCAOB requirements. There are more specific provisions addressing the firm's use of technology, and there are also some additional provisions related to externally communicated firm level and engagement level information. In addition, there are incremental requirements for firms that issue audit reports for more than 100 issuers per year. And for example, these firms are also required to establish an external oversight function for the QC system composed of one or more persons who can exercise independent judgment related to the firm's QC system. QC 1000 also specifically considers smaller firms. For example, firms that issue 5 or fewer engagement reports for issuers or broker-dealers in a year may include audits not performed under our standards in some of their monitoring activities. And in addition, depending on the nature and circumstances of the firm, including its size and structure, a single individual may be assigned more than one of the QC system oversight roles required under the standards. QC 1000 makes a distinction between firms that are simply registered with the PCAOB and those that perform audits. All PCAOB registered firms, even those who do not perform audits, will be required to design a QC system that complies with the new standard, whereas firms that perform audits of public companies or SEC registered broker-dealers will be required to implement and operate the QC system they design. Next slide. Firms that implement and operate a QC system would be required to annually evaluate their QC system and report the results on a new non-public Form QC. The firm's evaluation of the system would be performed annually as of September 30th and reported to the PCAOB no later than November 30th. QC 1000 and the related amendments take effect on December 15th, 2025. And so the initial evaluation would be performed as of September 30th, 2026, and initial reporting on new Form QC by November 30th, 2026. And as Erica mentioned, QC 1000 represents a significant change from our existing QC standards, and as such, we anticipate activities to support the implementation. And Erica mentioned some practice aids that we've published. We have been engaging with firms to understand any implementation timelines and initial questions, and hope to publish more detailed guidance after we understand what some of the initial questions are. And we'll also likely potentially conduct additional webinars. We did post a webinar that's I'll call it a detailed overview that's, I believe, around an hour and a half. So if anyone wants to spend some time with that webinar, I hope you enjoy it. Next slide. So moving on to the data amendments, as you've heard us say, the amendments are not designed to be the answer to the use of technology by auditors, but they're a stepping stone, a part of our effort to improve investor protection by modernizing our standards. And in part, the amendments clarify certain questions that have come up over the years related to the use of data analytics, but they also put in place certain guardrails for when technology tools are used in the audit. The amendments were designed to provide important clarification, and together they're designed to increase the likelihood that when auditors use technology-assisted analysis, they will obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence to support their audit opinion. So I'll briefly describe the amendments to AS 1105, that's our audit evidence standard. First, the amendments provide that if the auditor uses an audit procedure for more than one purpose, the auditor should achieve each purpose of the procedure. The amendments address auditor responsibilities when evaluating the reliability of external information provided by the company in electronic form, which has become much more prevalent. And the amendments also emphasize the importance of controls over information technology for the reliability of audit evidence, as auditors obtain and use large volumes of information in electronic form provided by the company. And lastly, the amendments emphasize the relevance of audit evidence and that it depends on the level of disaggregation or detail of information necessary to achieve the objective of the audit procedure. Next slide. With respect to responding to risk, the amendments include a new section that describes test of details and specifies the auditor's responsibilities when investigating items identified in a test of details. And under the new provisions, when performing a test of details, the auditor is required to apply audit procedures that are appropriate to the particular audit objective to each item selected for testing. And when the auditor identifies items that require further investigation, the auditor's investigation of those items is part of the auditor's response to risk. The effective date for the amendments is for audits of fiscal years beginning on or after December 15th, 2025. And we've not issued any initial staff guidance yet, but we'll consider after hearing whether firms have initial questions. Next slide. So I don't plan to get into the details on Rule 3502. Rather, I just wanted to highlight that the board had approved it, and it was effective as of October 21st, 2024, which was 60 days after the SEC approved it. We do have Connor Rasso in the meeting if members have questions on the rule. Next slide. And before I wrap up today, I just wanted to mention two staff spotlights that were developed by the Office of the Chief Auditor. And the first is relevant to today's discussion on AI. I won't get into details given it was in your prep materials. And so I hope you had a chance to read it. The second I want to mention, it should be available sometime today. As you can tell, our communications folks are very busy helping us run this meeting. But we plan to issue a staff spotlight on the auditor's responsibilities for detecting, evaluating, and making communications about illegal acts. It came to our attention as part of our outreach on our non-compliance with laws and regulations, that proposal, that it might be beneficial to give people a reminder of what's already required today. And as noted in the document, we also published a fraud resources webpage, which we hope auditors find useful as they move into their year-end audit work of what's out there as far as resources on fraud. Before I open it for questions, as mentioned, Jeff, would you mind spending a few minutes updating the SEIG on the IG selection of critical audit matters?
Thank you, Barb. Good morning, everyone. Let me begin with some background that led to the first annual Investor Advisory Group Critical or Key Audit Matter Awards for 2023. At the IAG's June 2023 meeting, a session was devoted to critical audit matters, which included an expert panel moderated by SEIG's and IAG's Sandra Peters. The purpose of the meeting was to explore more than 3 years after required implementation of AS 3101 investor views on critical audit matters relative to their initial potential. The expert panel was composed of former PCAOB Chief Auditor Mark Baumann, former PCAOB Chief of Staff Samantha Ross, the SEIG's Dr. Colleen Hannesberg, and Jared Goodman of the Colorado Public Employees Retirement Association. Following the June 2023 meeting, Sandra Peters prepared a draft memorandum for IAG member input that included a recap of the June panel presentation and 7 IAG recommendations. A majority of the IAG members responding to the memorandum approved of its issuance. Sandra Peters presented the approved IAG memorandum and the 7 recommendations contained therein at the October 2023 IAG meeting. Of the 7 IAG recommendations, 6 were directed at the PCAOB board and staff. In my personal view, the most important of those 6 recommendations were the 2 recommendations to potentially amend AS 3101 to 1, revise the especially challenging language used in paragraphs 11 and 12 of the standard for identifying potential critical audit matters. The IAG believes such language may actually be discouraging auditors from issuing potential CAMs. At the June IAG meeting, Mr. Baumann indicated his belief that the especially challenging language has been interpreted narrowly in a manner that results in a fewer number of CAMs being disclosed than the PCAOB had intended when the standard was issued. And I would note that a recent survey of 100 institutional investors by the Center for Audit Quality found that 58% of investors would prefer to see more critical audit matters in an auditor's report, and that 92% of investors use critical audit matters when they make investment decisions. The second IHE recommended amendment, AS 3101, that I also personally strongly support, is to revise the description of how the critical audit matter was addressed in the audit, and that's found in the note to paragraph 14C of the standard. More specifically, the recommended amendment would eliminate the optionality that currently permits auditors to omit disclosing two categories of information about CAMs that are of great interest to many investors, and that U.S. auditors have to date failed to provide. Those two categories of information explicitly permitted in the standard, but to date have not been provided by auditors, are one, an indication of the outcome of the audit procedures performed, and two, key observations with respect to the matter. And I would note that the recent survey of 100 institutional investors by the Center for Audit Quality referenced earlier found that 51% of investors would support increasing the detail provided in the CAMs. I'm hopeful that the PCAOB's current research agenda project, titled Communications of Critical Audit Matters, sometime soon will become a standard-setting project and propose amendments to AS 3101 that address these two IHE recommendations. So another recommendation approved by the IHE that I strongly support is an IHE initiative to annually solicit public input on examples of critical or key audit matters that are believed to provide decision-useful information to investors. The objective of this annual IHE initiative is to encourage auditors to continually improve the quality of information communicated to investors and the audit opinions of public companies. This initiative was officially launched at the April 2024 IHE meeting, and the PCAOB's Office of Investor Advocate issued an alert on April 29th requesting the public submission of examples of critical audit matters. The alert also stated that each submission should include an explanation of why the critical or key audit matter nominated provides decision-useful information to investors. As of the June 30th, 2024 deadline established in the alert, the IHE received submissions from 7 individuals or organizations referencing 26 individual key or critical audit matters from the 2023 audit reports of 12 registrants filing Form 10-Ks or Form 20-Fs. Of note, of the 26 individual key or critical audit matters referenced in the 7 submissions, 7 of those matters were from one registrant, BP PLC. Following the deadline for submissions, the IHE members were asked to review the 26 individual key or critical audit matters and vote for those 3 matters that they believed provided the most decision-useful information to investors. After several rounds of votes by IHE members, the 3 critical or key audit matters that received the most votes from IHE members were as follows. Number 1 was the goodwill and indefinite life intangible assets critical audit matter by Deloitte & Touche LLP at Berkshire Hathaway. Number 2 was the unpaid losses and loss adjustment expenses, retroactive reinsurance contracts, critical audit matter again by Deloitte & Touche LLP at Berkshire Hathaway Inc. And 3, the raw material inventory write-downs critical audit matter by Ernst & Young LLP at Moderna Inc. The 3 winners were announced at the September IHE meeting, which included a discussion of why the 3 critical audit matters provided decision-useful information to investors, and also how the 3 winning critical audit matters could be further improved. I'm currently in the process of developing an IHE report that describes the 26 key or critical audit matters nominated and discusses the 3 winning critical audit matters for 2023, including why members of the IHE believe they provide decision-useful information to investors, and also how the 3 winning critical audit matters could be further improved. The draft report will go through our standard IHE due process, and if approved by a majority of the IHE members voting, my current plan is to make the report publicly available prior to year end. So with that brief summary of the first annual IHE Critical or Key Audit Matter Awards for 2023, I'll turn it back to you, Barb.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you for all the work that you put into it. It was a great effort. With that, I will pause to see if members have questions or comments.
And we do have a question coming in from Christine Devine. Go ahead, Christine.
Thank you. Not really even so much of a question, but I wanted to first thank you, Jeff, for your incredible work on CAMs. And I don't just say that because 2 were Deloitte. I think you did great work there. So thank you so much. And I really wanted to thank the staff at the PCOB for your extraordinary efforts on standard setting that Barb, you walked us through, and Chair Williams walked us through. Just an amazing amount of work you all have produced. I very much appreciate in that regard to the resources that you, again, Barb and Chair Williams, walked us through. It is vital that we in the profession have implementation guidance, and your willingness to engage with us on that is critical too. And when I think about engagement, to the extent that we can get a formal, clear type of established process for how the profession prepares to interact with the PCOB in implementation, I think that's critical for high quality implementation. I also appreciated what Chair Williams said about no rush approach. That's very useful. And I think that becomes important when we think about the comment periods that are in place for proposals, because that gives us more time to react to them. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention on effective dates, just the importance of considering that holistically across the standards and the pace of change as the profession tries to react to all of those standards. So no real question, but just wanted to give some feedback.
Thank you so much. Danny, do you see any other hands raised?
Barb, we don't have any other hands raised at this time. Oh, and Jeff Mahoney, go ahead.
Thank you. Barb, this is just a comment, not a question, but there are two recent reports that were issued that I think are relevant to at least some of the PCOB's current agenda projects. And so I just encourage the PCOB staff to carefully review these two reports, their recommendations and related findings. So the first is a final report by the Australian Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services, entitled Ethics and Professional Accountability, Structural Challenges in the Audit, Assurance and Consultancy Industry. The 179-page report with 40 recommendations. And as I indicated, I believe a number of those recommendations and related findings may be relevant to a number of PCOB agenda projects, including the project on firm reporting that you mentioned earlier. Recommendation 15 of the report is generally consistent with the Investor Advisor Group's May 2024 comment letter in response to the firm reporting release, requiring that the financial statements of the Big Four be audited and made publicly available. A second report that I received just recently, it was a report by Railpen. Railpen is one of the UK's largest long-established pension funds with about 34 billion in assets under management. This is an October report. It's entitled Acting on Audit and Investor Stewardship Perspective. It's a 40 plus page report. It has 14 recommendations, including a recommendation of findings related to going concern that I think may be relevant, again, to the PCOB's short-term standard setting project on that topic. Thank you, Barb.
No, thank you so much.
And no further hands raised at this time.
Oh, thanks, Danny. Well, let's turn to our main topic for discussion today. The first discussion topic of the day, which really to me, it's several of you raised as a topic of interest. I also think it's responsive to those of you who asked to provide more input over time. So some projects like the Subsequent Events Project, they really lend themselves, I think, to more of a one-time opportunity for input. But others like technology allow us to get your input over time and on different aspects of a topic. So I'm excited to hear about this one today. I'm going to turn over the presentation to Carla Anderson from the Office of the Chief Auditor, who is joined by Kate Ostraszewski and Kalila Imperatrice of the Division of Registration and Inspections. I'm interested in this input this morning as well. I think auditors with an appropriate focus on current technologies can perform a high quality audit under the existing standards. The use of technology has changed significantly since the risk assessment standards were put in place. And so I think it's good to understand how views on technology currently affect the risk of material misstatement of the financial statements. With that, Carla, you can go ahead and kick off our discussion.
Thanks so much, Barb. Good morning, everyone. We will begin today's presentation. We can go on to the next slide, please, Brian. Thank you. We'll begin today's presentation with an introduction of the purpose of the session and what we're hoping to accomplish with the session. We'll then move on to mention the PCAOB auditing standards that are relevant to today's discussion and provide a brief overview of the requirements related to auditing IT that are included throughout the standards. We'll also go over some relevant developments in technology that are used in financial reporting. Next, we'll move on to our questions for discussion. We'll also discuss some of the insights from responses to the staff questionnaire that the SEIAG members were asked to complete. Thank you to those of you who did so. Our hope is that your responses will provide valuable data as we continue to evaluate the impact of the changing IT landscape to audits of issuers and determine what, if any, actions are needed by the PCAOB. Finally, for your reference, we've included an appendix that lists examples of changes in technology relevant to a company's control environment. We can go on to the next slide, please. As part of our ongoing initiatives to understand how developments in technology are impacting auditors and companies, we'd like to use the time today to discuss SEIAG members' views regarding the consideration of a company's IT risks and control environment as part of the audit, including how this has changed in recent years and what further changes are expected in the future. The information we gather today will help inform whether there is a need for guidance, changes to PCAOB standards, or other regulatory actions relating to this topic. To that end, we're also interested in whether SEIAG members are aware of any research papers, external reports, or other information related to the topic that should be taken into consideration. In summary, our discussion today will focus on feedback relative to IT that is being used by companies under audit. The effects of a company's use of IT can have a pervasive impact on how the company's audit is planned and performed. As such, we'll focus today's discussion on several standards that are key to conducting an audit pursuant to PCAOB standards. We'll go over certain requirements in each of these standards that are applicable to today's topic next. We can move on, Brian. Thank you. First, we'll discuss AS 2110, which establishes requirements regarding the process of identifying and assessing risks of material misstatements to the financial statements. It discusses the auditor's responsibilities for number 1, performing risk assessment procedures, and number 2, identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatement using information obtained from performing those risk assessment procedures. A firm's risk assessment process includes, among other things, understanding the company's objectives, strategies, and related business risks in order to identify business risks that could reasonably be expected to result in material misstatement of the financial statements. The standard includes the company's use of IT as an example situation in which business risks might result in material misstatement of the financial statements. For example, a potential related business risk might be that the systems and processes are incompatible. A firm's risk assessment procedures also include, among other things, obtaining an understanding of the company's internal control over financial reporting, or ICFR. ICFR consists of 5 components, including information and communication. Under this component, the auditor is required to obtain an understanding of the information system, including the required business processes relevant to financial reporting, which includes obtaining an understanding of how IT affects the company's flow of transactions. The standard highlights that the identification of risks and controls within IT is not a separate evaluation and is instead an integral part of the approach used to identify significant accounts and disclosures and their relevant assertions, and when applicable, to select the controls to test, as well as to assess and allocate audit effort. Finally, Appendix B of the standard discusses additional considerations related to obtaining an understanding of how the company uses IT, how IT affects the financial statements, and the extent of manual and automated controls used by the company, including IT general controls that are important to the effective operation of the automated controls. When a company uses IT to initiate, record, process, and report transactions, the IT systems and programs may include controls related to the relevant assertions of significant accounts and disclosures, or may be critical to the effective functioning of manual controls that depend on IT. Therefore, the auditor is required to obtain an understanding of specific risks to a company's ICFR resulting from IT. AS 2110 paragraph B4 provides examples of such risks, which include, among others, number one, reliance on systems or programs that are inaccurately processing data, processing inaccurate data, or both. Number two, unauthorized changes to data in master files. And number three, potential loss of data or inability to access data as required. In addition to identifying significant risks to a company's ICFR resulting from IT, the auditor is also required to obtain an understanding of how the company has responded to these risks. You can move on to the next slide, please. Next, we'll discuss the requirements in AS 2201 that are relevant to auditing IT. AS 2201 establishes requirements and provides direction that applies when an auditor is engaged to perform an audit of management's assessment of the effectiveness of ICFR. In other words, an audit of ICFR that is integrated with an audit of financial statements. Similar to the requirements of AS 2110, AS 2201 includes a requirement to understand how IT affects the company's flow of transactions. In addition, AS 2201 highlights a similar message that AS 2110 does, that the identification of risks and controls within IT is not a separate evaluation. Rather, it is an integral part of the top-down approach to identify significant accounts and disclosures and their relevant assertions, and to select controls to test. The standard requires the auditor to select controls to test that are important to the auditor's conclusion about whether the company's controls sufficiently address the assessed risk of misstatement to each relevant assertion. Appendix B of AS 2110 says, when a company uses IT to initiate, record, process, and report transactions, the IT systems and programs may include controls related to the relevant assertions of significant accounts and disclosures, or may be critical to the effective functioning of manual controls that depend on IT. Said another way, some of the controls a company selects to test may have an IT component. The requirements in AS 2201 are applicable to both manual controls and controls with an IT component, to the extent the auditor selects them to test. Those requirements include the requirements to test the design effectiveness and the operating effectiveness of those controls that are important to the auditor's conclusion about whether the company's controls sufficiently address the assessed risk of misstatement to each relevant assertion. AS 2201 goes on to include additional requirements and direction related to testing controls. We've not included the detailed excerpts of the standard, but we have included references to the paragraphs where the additional information can be found. The overarching reminder here is that the requirements of AS 2201 are applicable to all controls to test, including those with an IT component. The last bullet here mentions a section of Appendix B of AS 2201 that discusses a benchmarking strategy for automated controls that an auditor may use in subsequent years' audits. Because entirely automated application controls are generally not subject to breakdowns due to human failure, these requirements permit an auditor to use the benchmarking strategy on an automated control if certain factors related to the control indicate lower risk. However, after a period of time, the length of which depends on the circumstances, the baseline of the operation of an automated application control should be reestablished. The rule text goes on to provide factors the auditor should evaluate to determine when to reestablish the baseline. We can move on now. Thank you. Finally, we'll discuss certain of the requirements of AS 2301 that are relevant to auditing IT. AS 2301 establishes requirements regarding designing and implementing appropriate responses to the risks of material misstatement. Pertinently, the auditor must design and implement audit responses that address the risks of material misstatement that are identified and assessed in accordance with AS 2110, which we just discussed. As a general matter, the auditor should design and perform audit procedures in a manner that address the assessed risk of material misstatement for each relevant assertion of each significant account and disclosure. Therefore, to the extent that the auditor identifies and assesses a risk of material misstatement related to a company's IT environment, the auditor should design and perform procedures to address that IT-related risk. These procedures can be classified into two categories. Number one, tested controls, and number two, substantive procedures. With regard to the extent of test of controls, and specifically related to the company's IT control environment, AS 2301 includes that the effectiveness of relevant IT general controls could affect the necessary extent of testing of an automated control. Moving on now. Now that I've provided an overview of some of the PCAOB auditing requirements applicable to considerations related to a company's IT system, I want to take time to provide a few examples of relevant developments in technology, specifically focused on those developments that can have an effect on financial reporting. During our discussion in a few moments, we'd like to get your insights related to how changes in IT affect the risk of material misstatement and whether this has an effect on the auditor's ability to apply the existing requirements. To that end, we will discuss a few examples of recent developments in technology used in financial reporting. The first example listed on the slide involves external points of access to a company's financial reporting systems and data, such as remote access and third-party service organizations. Although centralized data centers can support mainframes and servers, employees do not have to be present where the hardware resides to sign on to financial applications. In today's remote and hybrid work environments, many employees are allowed to work from home and sign into financial applications to complete their tasks. The second bullet refers to financial reporting systems moving to cloud-based environments. Outsourcing of technical environments to third-party service organizations has become commonplace. Financial applications can reside in various types of cloud environments supported by third-party service organizations. There are various cloud computing models that include infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. We've also seen an evolution in methodologies that support software development, such as waterfall and agile. For example, tools are available to automate software development methodologies to rapidly deploy software, manage security, and manage operations. We have seen a change from completely restricting software developers from IT environments to controlling software developers' access to production IT environments by using certain tools. In years past, we did not see the use of robotic process automation, or RPA, supporting financial applications. Now, we see RPA being used to automate financial data entry and reconciliations. Changes in information technology, such as these, can cause changes in risks associated with financial statements, as well as changes in an organization's control environment. We've listed examples of additional changes in technology relevant to a company's control environment in the appendix to this presentation. Now we'll begin discussion of the questions to obtain your feedback. We look forward to hearing your views, experiences, and observations related to companies' risks and control environments. We'll start our discussion with the first 4 questions listed here on the screen, which I will read, and Danny will help us on calling each member when it is your turn. Question number 1. As a company's IT systems and extent of use of technology and financial reporting continues to evolve, what risks are you most focused on? Question 2. How do you believe the level of automation at an organization affects risks of material misstatement? And what additional controls need to be implemented to respond to these changes in risks, if any? Number 3, what business risks that could reasonably be expected to result in risks of material misstatement might external points of access to a company's financial reporting systems and data give rise to? What additional controls need to be implemented to respond to these risks, if any? And finally, how does the risk of segregation of duties change as more people with responsibilities for development and implementation of IT systems are now also responsible for operations and securities? What additional controls need to be implemented to respond to these changes in risk, if any?
And with that, we'll go ahead and open up the floor to any comments or questions for the team. Carla, I'm not seeing any. Oh, here we go. Brian Croto first.
Yep. Good morning. Thank you. maybe just a few things. And first, I might start by just saying, I do think this is a space where if you look at the PCAOB's inspection process, it's an area where there's a lot of time spent in each of the individual inspections of audit engagements, where I think there's a lot of rich data there in terms of at least historically and currently what companies are doing and then how we're responding to that from an audit perspective that I think could be useful to inform any standard setting here. Generally, the results are good in that space, but it doesn't mean there's not learnings and development that are important to consider. I think you've outlined this well in terms of kind of current standards and what the focus is today. There's obviously a lot one could look to from a COSO perspective and some papers that they've issued more recently that could be informative as well as you proceed with any standard setting in this space. The risks do continue to evolve. The use of technology evolves, obviously. When we look at general IT controls, or when you look at IT dependent controls, obviously looking at the complete and accurate operation, when you look at overall systems and the use, looking at business risks around it relative to either potential for ransomware or service attacks, intrusion detection can help obviously with that, but risks of material misstatement that could arise relative to safeguarding, whether it be extraction of cash or intellectual property, are risks, but they're not new risks. And even the segregation of duties risks that you're outlining or asking questions around, I don't think are new risks. The risks obviously evolve over time, and as we have increasing use of technology and systems that are being relied upon and interactions between them, the complexity of that can grow. But I think that the general standards that are in place today, the provisions in place today, and the standards and control frameworks are appropriate and continue to be appropriate. So I just kind of give that as, I guess, a starting point. And again, I do think it's important to use a lot of the rich information that you would already have from an inspection perspective.
Great. Thank you for those insights, Brian. We'll go ahead and move to Robert Hirth now.
Yeah, good morning, Danny. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. So a couple of things. But first on Brian's point, yeah, COSO has some good material. There's a paper on COSO in the cyber age. There's a paper on COSO, cloud computing and others. So one thing is not only to avail yourself of those existing publications, but one idea would be, would there be some benefit to COSO embarking on a new project related to this topic, given the sponsors of COSO? So that's point number one. In terms of your question number one on what I've been most concerned about, I think you've covered, and it's demonstrated in some of your findings. That's access and security of the system. Who can get in? When they get in, what can they do? Is that what you want? And how do you know? Those sound like simple questions. And then of course the change control. And so point number two, once there are established scripts that are creating automated controls that through benchmarking or other tools are deemed to be effective, to make sure that there's no change in any of the scripting. And I know that's an area that you've also focused on. My view is that the level of automation actually decreases the risk of material misstatement due to the fact that you have more automated controls. But it gets back to the change control aspect of that. Related to segregation of duties, I agree that more people are able to do more things for many reasons, including tools, and that much IT activity is in some respects moved into the finance function. So again, with respect to your findings in the past, the policies and the decisions made about access. So who decides who can have access, what access based upon their role or what needs to be done, and how is that monitored? So in all this, I think overall, the standards say a lot of good things. I just wonder if there's just a need for more specific guidance in terms of other materials and providing examples. I don't like to use the word checklist, but this very specific things that should be done and looked at. And I guess a question I have for Barb or others, is this topic out there because you're seeing more problems than in the past, and are deficiencies that you're finding at all related to small firms versus large firms, and perhaps where specialized team members with IT backgrounds are not being used?
Let me respond to that before we go on to anyone else. No, I would say no. We didn't add this to the agenda. In fact, it's not on the agenda, and nor do we choose to cover it today because of some concern that we had. It's one of those things where I just wonder if you set out to do an audit with just the standards in front of you, would you get to a good audit? Because I don't think what Carla went over, it's hard to say that that's reflective of the thousands of hours that are spent on these topics in a sizable audit. And while I think auditors have gotten there, would it be beneficial to have more, as you say, maybe guidance or otherwise, so that people can benefit from what's being done now and the thought that's been put into it? Thank you, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Bob and Barb. We'll move on to David Fabricant.
Yep. Hi. Am I audible okay?
Yep, coming in loud and clear. Thank you.
Yeah, Bob, you made some good points. A couple I'll underscore. I think, all the papers and frameworks and standards, I think are all helpful and useful, but I'm, as a sitting preparer and in a company that is massively transforming its core systems, and through my network with other very large public companies and talking to those controllers, we're all going through this transformation for lots of reasons. It's a lot easier now to develop software. It's a lot easier to implement it. We've all changed from waterfall to agile. That puts constant new functionality and code into the ecosystem. And the data supply chain really at the heart of this is what's changing at a very rapid pace. It's no longer a system produces a report and then accountants turn that into a journal entry. And this very much woven and intertwined data supply chain gives rise to automation, Bob, as you said, and I do agree with you that more automation yields better controls, but you have to also supplement that automation with different types of controls. You can't just kind of set it and forget it. You've got to understand what those automation controls are doing and be able to still check those and be comfortable with them. When I think about the business risks about external data points, at least I rely very much on info security and the environment, and companies should rely on the environment to make sure that those service providers are very well controlled with their InfoSec, and do all the due diligence that you can before you hire them and move your environment or your data into their environment, and then continue to check and talk to them and evaluate them and try to penetrate them. And on things like that, I think gives me some comfort, at least, that this is here and you've got to be able to get comfortable and deal with running some of your systems and processes outside of your environment. But I think if it's done in the right way, it certainly is much more beneficial. ITGC, I think, comes up in all of this and how you evolve ITGC. Bob, you mentioned entitlement access. I would certainly underscore that. That is dramatically changing. And I think the auditors need to be very ingrained with kind of the levels of access that employees get. Is it coding configuration? Is it admin? Is it view? There's very, very myopic different ways to slice entitlements, and getting that wrong, you can have unintended consequences with changes in financial reporting. The last comment I'd make on number 4 here with segregation of duties, I do think that there are more folks in finance that have the ability to configure systems that have a financial reporting impact, but not so much coding. I still believe that that is more germane to the technology departments. I think they get business requirements from finance. Those are turned then into technology requirements, and then the entire testing process happens before things are rolled out and implemented. But certainly more configuration, not so much coding, at least my perspective.
That's great. Thank you for those insights, David. We'll go ahead and move to Sarah Lord, and then Carla, after Sarah shares her comments and thoughts, we can go ahead and move on to the next screen of questions.
Excellent. Thank you. And adding to the thoughts on automation, I agree with David and Bob that we generally see automation reducing human error and adding value that way. But when we look at a control perspective, oftentimes what happens is the control operator shifts to someone who has a different background. So many of the controls, particularly in Agile has its own type of a Scrum structure. As you go through that, the controls are put in place and operated by someone typically with a technology or project management background. And so that person is going to be doing what the control says to do. They may not be thinking about any unintended consequences of that change. So it's really important that we shift up our understanding of the control within the whole control activities in the environment to say who's actually directing that change for the control. So you can test if the control works, but if the control was poorly designed or had an unintended consequence to start with, it doesn't matter if it's working correctly. And also we can see that sometimes across larger organizations, making sure that if a control is changed, it happens in every aspect or every department of the organization because they understand how that someone has to understand how all those changes flow into financial reporting. And so kind of going into the next two questions as well, see the same thing. Right now, there's not one model for how cybersecurity risk, for example, is handled between operational and financial reporting. So before we can figure out segregation of duties, we do need to go in and understand how does this live, these responsibilities live in this organization? And are we sure, is the organization sure, that every aspect is being considered? So someone looking at, access controls, cybersecurity risk, who's then taking that through to financial reporting? And so starting there, because there's not a one size fits all answer, there shouldn't be, because every organization is different, but really making sure we understand how that is set up and duties are appropriately segregated, but at the same time, that segregation doesn't create unintended consequences that nobody's stepping back and really looking to see how different controls impact financial reporting. Is something that we think about often. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sarah. Brian, if you want to advance the slide, and Carla, if you want to take us through the next set of questions, and then we can open up the floor again. Carla?
My apologies. Okay, question number 5. Do you believe that the use of technology will evolve from supporting the financial reporting process to being responsible for completing tasks with minimal human involvement? If so, what risks might this add, and are there additional controls that need to be implemented to respond to these risks? Number 6, have there been changes in how financial reporting teams are structured because of the new technologies being implemented? Do you believe the audit team structure should change in light of changes in companies' technology environments? Number 7, based on your experiences, are there areas within the standards discussed today that present questions or challenges in their application in light of changes in companies' technology environments? And lastly, are you aware of academic research papers, external reports, or other information that provide perspectives on this topic? Thank you.
Okay. And Christine Devine, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, just the human involvement one. I know that question comes up a lot, and I do not think it will lead to minimal human involvement. I'll be surprised if anyone disagrees with that. Raise your hand now, right? And I think that's clearly the case because professional judgment is so key in these areas. And even if we just focus on AI, which I know we will later, that's a case where we're going to be talking about using it in financial reporting. But without a doubt, the outputs are going to have to be reviewed by humans. And in addition, if you think about controls around that, humans will need to design monitoring controls and actually review those controls. So that's where an important human element comes in. The next question about the financial reporting team structure, I'm not aware of significant changes there. I did want to mention, though, that I'm seeing a quite increased level of engagement at the full board and the audit committee level on technology. We've done some recent surveys. Technology in general always comes out as one of the very top issues that boards are focusing on. Now it's certainly AI and Gen AI as well, where they're trying to really figure out how companies use it. And how their control environment is impacted by that, and thinking about what is their oversight exactly at the board and audit committee level with respect to technology. And they're also thinking about the skill set. You know, does the audit committee members and board members have the right expertise, particularly if they are using AI and Gen AI? So I think that's a good trend where we're seeing that. I'm actually seeing a lot more chief information officers attending those board and audit committee meetings, which is showing the importance of technology there. As far as our audit teams, you'll see some changes in skill sets that are needed with technology. So just as an example, if they were switching from an Oracle system to an SAP system, you may need some more resident SAP knowledge on your audit team. On 7, I think based on the current standards, we don't believe that there are challenges here. And those are my thoughts.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine. And we'll move to Preeti Chowdhury.
Good morning. I wanted to just point out that I had access to some of the PCAOB inspection data related to IT. It was a little bit limited, of course, but basically some of the things we find in that paper suggest that IT is a pretty significant concern for material misstatement. And I think the reason is somewhat logical. If you have an issue in IT, it becomes very pervasive. Right, so a small thing can get blown up pretty easily. But there's, I think, 2 things in the findings that I wanted to draw attention to, and also point out that there's additional sites there about other research papers that do automation and so forth. But one finding is that there's a significant effect based on how the audit is staffed. So if there's really good staffing, specifically at the manager level, with more experienced IT managers supporting the team, that does help mitigate some of the risk from IT, especially when they're more complicated situations. And secondly, another interesting finding is that staffing actually spills over beyond the audit, and we find some evidence that it improves the company's operations overall by reducing outages and so forth. And so I think that's nice for the audit firms to see that there is a spillover effect to the benefit of staffing the team well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Preeti. And Ron Edmonds, if you want to go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I just want to maybe reinforce a comment that Christine made about the human involvement. I certainly agree that, as things change, and, they've changed a lot over the last 10 years, and I think the speed of change will only accelerate in the next 10 years. For example, when, RPA came out, it certainly did increase the speed and the efficiency for some of these things, for example, but still the need to have human oversight to make sure things made sense and the control environment was appropriate continued. I think that will continue as we get into AI, et cetera. I think the human involvement will change, but it does need to be there. And our question 6 about the, I think the team structures, will they change? I do think they have changed and they'll continue to change. I know from the company that I worked, over the last many years, we had continued to increase the number of people and with a technology background, IT type people, into the controller group that helped with setting up our systems, our processes, and some of our reporting as well. And I think those people added a tremendous amount of value. They're not, we're not moving away from, accountants and finance professionals for sure, but I think having those other professionals that really understand the technology, can leverage those skills across an organization, have paid huge dividends. And I think we'll continue to see that trend going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron. And we'll move to David Fabricant.
Yeah, thanks. Ron, you stole half of what I was going to say. So you're spot on with that. Good to see you, by the way. The only thing I would say is, going back to my prior comment on the data supply chain that controllers and finance teams have now is unprecedented. We have more access to real-time, super granular data that's driving financial reporting daily, In fact, you can get it every 30 seconds if you want it in some cases, if your ecosystem is designed that way. You get streams of data. That has transformed the way some finance teams are structured, and we're bringing in more data experts. Those people, kind of fintech, that have a passion for accounting and controllership, but also really love working with large volumes of data, and that can be very transformational in the way we set up our processes and do our roles. And so I would just mention that is, to me, evolved at a lightning speed and will continue to as companies evolve to these more modern systems.
Great. Thank you very much, David. I'm not seeing any other hands up right now, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my colleagues in the Division of Registration and Inspections, and they're going to take us through a discussion based upon the survey that many members completed in advance of this meeting. So Kate and Kalila, if I can hand it over to you.
Certainly. Thank you, Danny. Hello, my name is Kate Ostaszewski, and I'm an Associate Director in our Division of Registration and Inspections. And my colleague, Kalila Imperatrice, who is an inspection leader within the Division of Registration and Inspections, and I will now lead the discussion with respect to the next part of today's program. To facilitate today's discussion on information technology risk in financial reporting, considering today's technology environment, DRI collaborated with OCA to develop a questionnaire which we asked the SEIAG members if they could reply to a series of questions in advance. On behalf of the PCAOB, OCA, and DRI, I want to thank the SEIAG members for completing the survey. DRI would also like to thank OCA for allowing us to collaborate on this effort. Now, we have summarized the results received, and we will provide you with a summary and ask for some further discussion as part of today's session to get some additional insights. To understand the background of the respondents, we asked whether each respondent had background in any of the following: accounting, auditing, corporate finance, corporate governance, and/or investing in public companies. 16 individuals responded to our survey, and while the greatest percentage of experience was with auditing and corporate governance, overall, we had a good mix of each category of expertise in those participants who responded to the survey. I will now turn it over to Kalila in order to drive some of the details to facilitate our discussion. Kalila?
Hello, it's Kate.
Kalila, we're currently not seeing your video or audio. And Kate, I'll give it a second here, but I might ask you to jump in and pick up for Kalila if her audio.
No problem.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and do that, Kate, that would be great.
Yeah, just let me get my address. Yes, I will jump in on behalf of Kalila. And we'll start with the first series of questions, which was, which of the following technologies are you aware of companies using as part of the financial reporting IT environment? And we had given a series of about 30 different technologies to consider. What we found is the top categories that participants indicated were cloud computing, internally developed systems or infrastructure, multiple databases or data warehousing, and the use of software as a service, platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service. Now, all of these categories had an indication that one or more individuals were aware of use. So we had no category out of the 30 that were not checked. A few other technologies were identified, specifically the use of queries and report writers, and another interesting category, which was sustainability data collection and reporting systems. Two of the top categories involved the use of third parties in the IT environment. So what we wanted to ask the members was, to what extent are service organization control reports available for these third parties that are involved in the company's IT environment? And in addition to service organization control reports, what controls are important within the company to manage financial reporting risk when third parties are involved?
And we'll go ahead and give it a second if anyone has any responses to those particular questions. Okay, David Fabricant, go ahead.
I would just say again, as a preparer, I mean, the SOC reports are super critical. We want to understand what's going to come in the SOC reports, the timing of when we get them, because we will rely on those controls. We looked before, you engage a service provider, if you can see prior SOC reports that are issued, were there any exceptions? And what were they and how were they remediated? So I certainly do rely on SOC controls, and I want to understand exactly what the report is and what we're going to get and when we're going to get it.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. Not seeing any other hands. So Kalila, I see your video is back. So if you want to check your audio and pick up with the second point.
Okay, I hope it's working and doesn't
Yeah.
crash on me. It's
You're
ironic
great.
we're talking about technology and then technology fails. So our next question that we're going to go over is, what type of new technology do you believe that companies will introduce into their future financial reporting environment? So we had the categories of 1 year, 2 to 5 years, and 6 to 10 years. So the responses were similar for both categories 1 and 2. And unfortunately, respondents were not able to predict the future and didn't have much to say about the 6 to 10 year category. So the top 3 new technologies that were mentioned were, of course, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and the continued use of cloud technology. The other technologies that were mentioned, but not as frequently, were microservices, low code, machine learning, and robotics process automation. So our question relates to the fact that some respondents noted that the traditional approaches to testing IT general controls and IT application controls may not be sufficient for the newer technologies. So we are interested in some thoughts for us to consider as to why the traditional approaches would not be sufficient and what would need to change.
Give everyone a minute to think about those questions, Kalila, and see if we have any hands. Okay, Sarah Lord, go ahead.
Thank you. So from when we think about testing ITGCs and how the underlying technology impacts it, some of the things that we're thinking about is right now we can often directly test the controls as they're operating, or directly test the coding that happens to create those controls. As we move into things that are more AI driven or sensitivity based, it's considering whether we would move to kind of model-based sensitivity testing or scenario-based testing, which are already things that are used in in the development and coding process if you're doing high code development, but looking from an auditor side to see, do we need to adapt any of those types of testing in our testing? Right now, we're not necessarily seeing that. I don't necessarily think the standards would need to change to enable us to do that. Standards really allow us to test however we want to within the parameters, but right, to design the further out procedures as we want to. But those are the kind of things we're thinking about of if the control that's created is not just a direct coding to do this, and this is a result, we might need to do more scenario testing as part of our testing as well.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Bob Hirth, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Sarah made an important comment and we're talking about, kind of changes in technology. She made a comment about the control shifts to, a different person, or the nature of the control needs to change because the process or the flow or whatever has changed. So I think that's really important. And I think David made an important point. Again, as this technology moves over to more third parties, the SOC reports are really just critical. So, I think as this changes, the key to me for the audit firms are, do they recognize the change do they have the skills to, properly evaluate the change? But I also want to go back, maybe David won't like what I'm going to say, but, I learned a saying from one of the accounting firms about a month ago, which is management goes first. So the whole notion that, yet the auditor needs to do a lot of stuff, needs to consider all these things through standards, but management goes first. What did management do to look at the controls? What did management do to evaluate the new technology? What is management doing about, staffing and expertise? And again, I know you can't put it all on the company, and the auditor has a role, but at the end of the day, it is, I don't want to call it a team, but management's got to go first and do quite a bit of work around this topic, as well as just the auditor doing the back end. I'm auditing it. Sorry, David.
Bob, I 100% agree with that, by the way. It is our responsibility. We're leading it. We need to make sure the auditors understand or in the right areas at the right time so that they can design their audit procedures to test it. But I'm 100% in alignment with you.
Thank you very much, both Bob and David. And we'll move over to Ron Edmonds.
Yeah, I'm off mute. And David answered it pretty well for me too, but I do think, management does need to go first, but anytime there's a change to any system, anything like that, we do have to look at that. What from a control perspective has changed? We have to document those controls. We have to, test those before we even get engaged with the audit firms, right? So I do think, I 100% agree, management needs to go first and needs to think about it on a very proactive basis, right? Because, minor things can impact huge populations of data and transactions out there. So any change at all could be potentially huge. The other thing I wanted to say, I think there was a question out there about is there any issue with companies obtaining SOC reports? And to date, from my past, we've never had an issue doing that. I think as we go into looking at getting a third-party service provider to do anything, that's one of the top things on the list, right? If it's material, they have to be able to do that. If they don't, they just get scratched from the list of service providers very quickly.
Great. Thank you for those insights, Ron. And we'll move to John Lukomnik.
Yeah, I just want to point out that in financial services firms, and I suspect in other firms as well, but where I chair an audit committee, the move to third-party service providers is not just SOC reports, but the audit committee gets involved in understanding what the level of due diligence that management may go first, but in this case, I think the audit committee goes second, because the audit committee gets involved in understanding what the level of management due diligence is in anything that touches an essential accounting system. Otherwise, we get knocked by the SEC for failure for control environment. And so, I do think that there is a huge amount of not just SOC report, but actual diligence going on in terms of everything from the control environment to compatibility and where the access points are. And normally that is also discussed at length, I think, at least in the audit committees that I've been on. So another touch point for the auditors and for the PCAOB here is what the audit committee does in terms of its oversight and its responsibility in terms of control environment.
Great. Thank you very, very much, John. We'll go over to Brian Croto.
Yep, maybe just a few things to add to all that. And I agree that it's not necessarily the inability to get SOC reports where appropriate, but it's also important to understand that, and some of this was raised, but the timing in which you're going to get them, the quality of the work that's been done, recognizing there's a range of different types of firms that might be involved in those. Many of them are not PCAOB registered firms. Some may be fairly small boutique firms, and understanding the quality of the work, the sufficiency of the work that's been done. Is it adequate? First from a management perspective, then from an auditor's perspective. We frequently raise questions in our work, as I know companies do in their evaluation, that shines light on the fact that perhaps some of the work is inadequate for the company to place reliance on the SOC report. And then another important point is the pervasiveness of the use of third parties, to the points that's been raised. And the concentration around certain service providers can create some degree of financial reporting risk when something does occur and there is an issue that occurs. Companies need to deal with that, and that can affect large numbers of public companies at the same time, could have pervasive impact. And then there's the interface with the company's controls and making sure that's well understood relative to what the company is responsible for versus what the service provider is responsible for, well documented and then well tested relative to those interfaces working appropriately. So there's a lot to think about there. And I think it's easy to just sort of say that it all kind of works, but as it gets more complicated relative to the nature and extent of what is being performed by service providers from an IT perspective, I think it calls for increased focus on the way we think about those types of reports and the way management and auditors use them in support of their work. So I just want to raise some of those points.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. And Kalila, seeing no further hands, so if you want to take us through the third discussion topic based upon the survey results.
Okay. The next topic is the question: in your experience, under what circumstances would you expect the company board level involvement? Am I still on?
Your screen is frozen. We can hear you, Kalila.
But you can't hear me. Okay, I'll just restart. In your experience, and under what circumstances would you expect the company board level involvement when new technology is introduced into the company's existing financial reporting IT environment, or when the existing financial reporting environment is being modified? So based on the respondents, there were key triggers for board involvement were presence of material risk, a significant investment in technology, or the introduction of emerging technology in overall IT governance. So there was a range of views from some respondents that indicated that the board should be involved overall in governance related to the IT environment. And there were also different views whether it should be the board or the audit committee that should be involved. It was also clear that there was recognition that it was important for board or members of the boards to not step into the role of management. So when we're thinking about best practices, what role should the board play in risk mitigation with respect to the company's IT environment?
And we'll open up the floor for any questions or comments. Bob Hirth, go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple things on this one, and I really tried to look at the surveys. This seemed to be a financial reporting only modification. So I just tried to remember that. But I started with, my logic was, first of all, materiality. Like someone said, is it, how pervasive is it? What's the investment? Sometimes the board gets involved because of the investment. But I really went back on the audit committee, which I'll come to in a second. But the order I went through was, my personal experience, I've seen a lot of these. I mean, they happen all the time. Christine mentioned, Oracle to SAP. I think we see more, Great Plains or Microsoft Dynamics to Oracle, even moving from premises to cloud and all that. So the example given was quite normal and something that a lot of us see. So I started with materiality. And then again, management goes first. What's management doing to report this and cover it themselves? Forget reporting to the board or the audit committee. Yeah, what are they doing to circle the wagons and get this up? I felt that my experience was the audit committee generally had primary responsibility for the oversight of management on this one, because again, the example given was financial reporting only. I also brought in the notion of many times outside third parties or consultants that are not the audit firm of the company are involved in the transition and the conversion or the new implementation, so forth. And they're doing testing as well as management's doing testing. So I really looked at this whole idea, audit committee doing oversight, but management really taking responsibility, and the role that the third party consultant had in telling their story about how they're overseeing the application change, the testing they're doing, et cetera. And then finally, of course, the audit firm. So again, my experience was once one of these got going, there was a pretty regular cadence of reporting. So faster reporting probably within the company, again, the consulting firm and management, and then at every audit committee meeting, probably for the duration of that project that's deemed material or significant, that there was reporting by both management and in many cases the consulting firm. And then of course the audit firm being in those meetings and the audit committee asking that firm about their view, how does it change their approach, et cetera. So those were some of my comments. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. And we'll move over to Dane Mott.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to kind of highlight the importance of having the board involved, especially in the thought of kind of resourcing this, resourcing the financial reporting system. And I can think of like internal control problems as a user. I feel like I see more internal control problems at smaller companies or emerging growth companies just becoming public. And I think that what that kind of speaks to is there's kind of a life cycle that companies are going through. And a lot of times you have to kind of transition to more and more sophisticated professionals, whether it be in your financial reporting professionals or your IT professionals, from being, an upstart to being a very large, mega cap company. And so I think it is important that the board's kind of involved, because the board is going to be the party that's really going to initiate that transition of talent, and kind of make those the professionals running the IT systems and the financial reporting systems upgrade the talent through time, so that the systems can become more robust. And then just one other element, especially the past decade or so, you've had a lot of companies that are kind of executing serial acquisition strategies where, time after time, they're, some are buying dozens of companies per year, and that creates other kind of integration issues. So while the audit committee has a lot of responsibility, especially whether it's kind of managing that evolution and kind of putting the appropriate resources into these functions, or kind of if you're executing a business strategy that's going to be very dependent on serial acquisition, I think that these are kind of board level discussions, and you want to make sure that things don't just kind of get mitigated to the audit committee. These are kind of key to business strategy and risk mitigation.
Great. Thank you very much, Dane. And we'll move over to John White.
Yes, a couple of comments from the lawyer's perspective. First, there really in recent years has been a growing focus on the board's responsibility for controls and oversight of controls. You may have heard the word Caremark or Caremark responsibilities. I won't go into the law here, but that's the case, and that's the area. So I think this is all increasingly important for boards. Second point, I guess, I think this really needs to be at the audit committee. There's so many different things that the board has to do, and this, at least what we're talking about today, seems very audit committee focused, and I think they can do a better job of it than trying to disperse it across the board, given how busy boards are. And third point, I must say, listening to all of this, I mean, including those 30 technologies that were at the, in the first question, I didn't even know what to check when I got to those boxes. But I feel like there's an education need here. And so I guess one thing I would put on everybody's list is educating the audit committee on the things we are talking about, or the board, but the audit committee, who I think should be responsible for the things we're talking about here today. And I realize some of that comes from the audit firms that come and other places, but this feels like a nice thing to go in the next spotlight for audit committees that the staff puts out. Anyway, a few lawyer comments.
Great. Thank you very much, John, for those insights and recommendation. We'll move over to Bob Hirth. Oh, Bob, you are on mute right now.
Sorry, just to comment on Dane's remarks and John's, and go back to what I submitted was what I also wanted to add was generally, again, based upon materiality and risk, that I saw it being a usual process for the audit committee chair to give his or her report at the full board meeting on the status of that new information system, et cetera. And maybe in some cases, depending on materiality, the consulting firm, if it was appropriate, would be part of that. So Dane, I think your point's well, the expertise, or supposedly has maybe more expertise, but yeah, absolutely. And especially when you talk about the impact of this technology on strategy. But again, with pure financial reporting, which kind of the example was alluding to, audit committee oversight, audit committee chair reports to the full board as appropriate.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. And Dane, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, just to respond, Bob, I'm in agreement. I do think a lot of the nitty-gritty detail needs to happen within the audit committee chair. I guess my whole point is just like more of these summaries have to get up to the board level and for those discussions, because if you are asking for resources and you are saying like, hey, it's kind of a tone at the top thing. Is this a firm that actually is going to invest in financial reporting or not? You can have an audit committee who wants to do it, but if you don't have buy-in from the board, those resources aren't going to get allocated. So that was just my point, but agree. A lot of the work has to be done with the audit committee. The other thing I'll say is I was on a panel. I spoke to a bunch of audit committee chairs at a conference about a month ago. And a lot of them were talking about now how cybersecurity gets thrown into their audit committee. And a lot of them don't feel like they have the skill set to really make the judgments about cybersecurity. And that's kind of also something that's kind of coming in here. So, whether that be the emergence of a new committee that's also kind of has the expertise that really can kind of evaluate cybersecurity issues. I think it has to work in cooperation with audit committee, but, do the typical backgrounds of the people who would be on your audit committee be the ones who could make smart comments and decisions about cybersecurity? Do they have the expertise? And that's kind of that's a question for the larger board. Do they need to add more people to the board who actually have that background and can kind of mitigate that risk?
Great. Thank you again, Dean. We'll move over to Jim Hunt.
Thank you very much. I think all great comments. The one I would add is to just make sure we stay at the strategic and risk-based level. There's a real ease of moving into, kind of the management level. I take John's comments importantly about both Caremark and the consideration of internal controls at the board level. But that's from the perspective, in my view, of enterprise risk management. And then enterprise risk management then moves to what kind of systems do we have to implement and execute what we've directed management strategically to do. And I think you have to stay at those levels and be very, very careful. There's an age-old debate going on right now to Dane's comments about, how many people and what committees, et cetera. And I think we shouldn't forget that if we don't know everything that we think we might need to know as audit committee chairs, that we can buy some expertise outside. We don't have to rely only on management. We can go to outside experts that can augment us and give us independent considerations that we don't have to, have a specific cyber expert on a new committee or necessarily on our audit committee. But I think just keeping the risk management and the strategic considerations at the board level, I think, is important as we get into these things. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And John White, go ahead.
I just wanted to go back and reinforce that I agree entirely that first that, the board is in an oversight role. They're not in a management role. And that is where this should be. I don't worry about the audit committee not having resources that Dane was suggesting. I think the audit committee has the resources and can develop the expertise. That's all.
Great. Thank you, John. And Kate, if you want to pick back up on our next discussion point, we do have 9 minutes left in this session, Kate. So I defer to you as to whether you want to go to discussion point 4 or 5.
Yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll summarize discussion 4, and then I will just move into the question for 5. So I appreciate everybody bearing with me. So the next series of questions that we asked about is, are there aspects of emerging IT that may expand or change risk to financial reporting? And if so, what are they? And we also asked, under what circumstances might a highly increase or reduce the level of financial reporting risk? And in summary, what we heard was the key risk considerations included the rapid emergence of new technologies, changes to people, processes, and technologies, increases in cybersecurity risk, deployment of generative AI to replace controls, increases in data dependencies, safeguarding of digital assets, and the effectiveness of governance and monitoring. Generally, whether auditors and companies were encountering the use of new technology or changes to technology, these key considerations applied to both. All respondents acknowledged that automation could reduce certain risks related to human error, but also believed that other risks arose with the adoption of widespread automation. And some respondents indicated that the need for ongoing human oversight and manual processes in an automated IT environment would continue. With that, I'll bring us to our last question and discussion topic. And that was, do we think that companies and auditors have appropriately adjusted their procedures related to information technology general controls? And that would be controls over program development, program change, information security, and computer operations. Have they been modified to address the financial reporting risks presented by current and emerging technology environments? And we had asked for a yes or no. And most respondents believe that there may need to be adjustments, but that most companies and auditors are using subject matter professionals to assist with these risk considerations. Another important point is some respondents highlighted that skills shortages can be an issue for both auditors and companies. So I think what we'd like to hear is, as it relates to things that might need to change, if members could possibly expand on that point and provide us with some specific thoughts, that would be appreciated.
Okay, go ahead, Bob Hirth.
So I want to divvy this up a little bit. John's comment, I think the big companies, I think, hopefully have got this, covered. They've got the resources and the people and the structure and all that stuff. Dane made a really good comment about, I think, his concern for these smaller companies that don't have the resources. I guess what I would say, and I think about the emerging technologies, and people can argue with me, but where the smaller company begins the use of this newer emerging technology or moves to the cloud and moves things off to these bigger providers that actually have better controls than they could ever have at their smaller company, I think that in many respects reduces overall risk at that smaller company. And I guess the point that I would bring up, and it gets back to Barb's comment, I mean, this is just an ever-evolving topic. It's never going to stop. I mean, the smart people are going to keep coming up with newer and newly creative opportunities to change the way financial reporting is done through automation. But I think we ought to think a little bit about, are there two solar systems here? Are there the big companies that have got lots of specialists, and then there's that smaller company, and if that smaller company especially can risk really get reduced through the movement to these newer technologies, especially, cloud and SaaS-based services where the controls at the provider, again, are greater than the company might otherwise have.
Great, thank you, Bob. Looking to see if there's any other hands raised. Oh. John White, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where it fits in, but I just will throw in one of the things an issue that bothers me as a lawyer. With the increased technology, where you are basically looking at testing 100% of the transactions or the data set, you obviously get a lot more exceptions than you would get if you're just looking at samples or test samples. And the question becomes, with all those additional hits you get, what do you track down and how do you track them down? Because tracking down all of them, may not be feasible, But at least when I think about this from a litigation perspective, when you're looking back at it, if you've got all these, hits that have a problem or potential problems and you haven't tracked them down, that's not a good place to be. But that's what you get when you look at 100% of the data set. So
John, let me respond to that. We do address that in the data amendments that were finalized in June. We recognize that sometimes a large number of hits is because of the way the test was designed, and that maybe the test didn't take into account, variations in processes or different types of transactions. And so the auditor has the ability to take those out of the mix. And I think it's really reflective of what we saw that were best practices and when people use these tools. But when you're using the tool as a substantive audit test, a test of details, you do have to give consideration that those hits could represent a risk of material misstatement. So the auditor would have to look at least at some of them, but that's addressed in that that project. But yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, John and Barb. Barb, I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time, so I'll pass it back over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you all, and thank you to Carla, Kate, and Kalila. As mentioned, our Emerging Issues and Auditing Subcommittee will provide a brief intro to our AI discussions, then after which we'll have a 15-minute break going into breakout sessions, and then we'll roll right into lunch. For members of the public who've joined us online, thank you for your time this morning. The public meeting will resume at 1:30 after lunch. And Preeti, I'll turn it over to you or someone else on the Emerging Issues Subcommittee. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. As Barb mentioned, my name is Preeti Chowdhury. I'm a professor at the University of Arizona, Dhaliwal Reedy School of Accountancy. And there are several other members I'd like to acknowledge who have contributed to our preparation of these materials. That would be Dane Mott, Jim Hunt, Brian Croto, and David Fabricant. And I also want to mention, while we chose to focus on AI as an emerging issue, that if any of the members of the SEAG have ideas for future topics we should focus on, to feel free to reach out to either me or any of the other members to share those views. Thank you. Could you advance to the next slide, please? Okay, so I thought we would just start off with trying to define AI, which is honestly a little bit scary and overwhelming, because as we come up with a definition, it also feels like the rapid change is happening so quickly that it's not clear if the definition is sufficient. Personally, I liked the OECD definition, which is that it's a machine-based system that infers from input it receives how to generate output, such as predictions, content, recommendations, or decisions. But some additional thoughts on AI is that there's a wide variety of different implementation approaches relative to traditional software. It has the ability to solve complex problems. It's not inherently intelligent, self-learning, or creative. And it also may not always be correct. Garbage in, garbage out. It may not solve the problems that you want it to, or the way you want it to solve problems. So there are certainly a number of limitations with AI. Could you please advance the slide? So when we think about governance challenges to AI, there's a variety of unique challenges. Typically, governance approaches may differ between trying to govern something that is an object versus trying to govern something that involves people. But then when you look at AI, there's a lot of things that sort of don't fit nicely into those buckets. So for example, if you're trying to regulate a car, that would be object-oriented and may take a different approach versus trying to regulate a driver, which is a person. But then when you look at a self-driving car, it's neither a person nor an object. And so it becomes a little bit more complicated. A second unique, I think, aspect of governance is the risk of collusion. in the space of auditing, you know, collusion is not new, but we traditionally typically think about it as people coming together to collude. And what's new here is that we may have systems that are inadvertently coming together to collude, and that can lead to undesirable outcomes. A third issue with governing AI is that the training may, if it's not appropriate, can lead to systemic biases. And I think we've all seen a number of examples reported in the news. One that sticks out to me is in the application of trying to automate these loan processes, and that the systems were trained based on the data generated by people, which do tend to have some biases towards who they're approving in the loans and so forth, and that the system then just continued to perpetrate those biases because that's the data it was trained on. Another issue is that in order to actually train the systems, you need a lot of data, and some of that data may violate privacy rules or regulations in terms of how data can be shared. So that creates another issue. And then, of course, the rapid change of, you know, is happening at a pace that is kind of hard to imagine. Let's see, ChatGPT was released just about 2 years ago, and we've already seen a number of multiple performance improvements. And so given this pace of change, it's hard to wait for governance. If you wait for governance, it may just be too late. Can you advance the slide, please? So what I did was what we did is take a typical like governance principles and try to adapt them a little bit to AI as a way of thinking about some of the issues in a more systematic way. For example, accountability is a significant aspect that needs to be addressed by AI governance. And that refers to basically the user and the developer of the AI technologies and how they might be encouraged to use it responsibly. A second key aspect of AI governance is transparency. One of the unique issues about AI is that it can come up with different answers. If you sort of repeat the process one after another, it could come up with different answers, and it's hard to explain why the answers are different. And that is sort of unique to using relative to other technologies. A third issue is about fairness. You know, data sets may not incorporate all of the relevant environment, and so some people and circumstances may be left out. Or they could be trained on using human judgments that already have bias, which can only perpetuate the bias. We've got reliability as another issue for AI governance to make sure that the data that's going in is complete and accurate so that we get reliable output. And of course, security and privacy issues with sharing the data and training the system. So if you can advance to the next slide. So we were discussing sort of that there are, amongst our group, there are different approaches to AI governance the PCAOB could consider. And I'm just going to lay out 3 approaches here. So one approach is to say, you know what, the existing standards are sufficiently principle-based, and AI is just another tool. We've seen a lot of other tools, some of which have been mentioned today. And we'll continue to see new tools. And so we don't need a specific framework for AI because it's just a tool. A second approach is that, you know, if you go to the other extreme, is that the PCAOB as a regulator could develop an AI framework to ensure that it's being used appropriately to mitigate risk and to act reliably. And this could be done using a number of different options. One option is to take an existing framework, maybe one from COSO, and modifying it, or some other regulatory agency and modifying it to the audit industry. A third option could be to decide whether it should be outcome focused or process focused, and to understand that there would be some difference in terms of how things are updated to whether you take either of those approaches. So, and then a third approach is to say, I guess, something in the middle, which is that the PCAOB could require the audit firms themselves to develop their own governance framework for AI technologies. and that the PCAOB may be part of its review system and DRI to review these frameworks or test them, and maybe even report on them, and of course share best practices. So those are three options, and I think that we're going to next move to a poll to get your initial thoughts on whether you think approach 1, 2, or 3 should be preferred.
Yes, Preeti, we are. And before I do that, for SEAG members, I have placed a link in the chat box. Again, I believe Preeti, you only and Danny, you only want SEAG members to respond to this, not PCAOB staff or observers. So with that, I will advance to this polling slide. Again, SEAG members, if you can click the link that is in the chat box, it should open up in your internet browser, and you should be able to respond to the question.
And Brian, if you want to move back a slide, we're not seeing that results slide. Perfect, thank you.
I'll give it another minute. It's nice to see this real time. Okay, we had what, about 20 members? Oh, so we still have some responses coming in. So far it looks like a majority of people like approach C, which is that the PCAOB requires the audit firms themselves to develop an AI framework and then to evaluate it. And the second most popular is A, which is that, you know, our existing rules are fine and AI is just a tool. We don't need to worry about it. And then we have a minority of members who believe the AI framework should be developed by PCAOB, or that none of the approaches is preferred. And we're gonna, when we go into the breakout sessions, you'll have an opportunity to share these thoughts with the group as well, so that we can report back if there's some good reasons I'm sure you all have for what you picked. Can we advance to the next slide, please? Brian, could you advance the slide?
Yes, give me just a moment here. There we go.
Perfect. Okay, so a framework for AI and auditing, whether developed by the PCAOB or the firms, could address some of these questions that we brainstormed as a committee. For example, how does the auditor respond to management using an AI tool in the financial statement preparation? I think in our earlier discussion, it was mentioned and agreed upon by several people that management tends to go first and then, you know, the auditor follows. And so that's kind of consistent with where we started with how does the auditor respond to management using the AI tool? And then a second question is, how will the auditor's testing of control design and operation evolve when it's applied to an AI executed task? Like, is there something unique about testing it AI that maybe didn't apply to the other ways we tested other technologies or processes? What procedures should the auditor perform to understand how management determines that they can rely on the information produced by AI? And how will the auditor assess the reliability of audit evidence that might be applied to these processes and controls? In terms of the risk assessment procedures, are there certain areas of financial reporting that pose more risk when performed by AI? And are there areas of auditing that might pose more risk when they're performed by AI? What responsibilities do auditors have, including communications with the audit committee, when it comes to being transparent about the level and specificity of how AI is used? And what standard or practice guidance should the PCAOB develop to help establish what is and what is not permissible under auditor, or what is not permissible auditor behavior with respect to rapidly emerging technologies and the resulting risks. Note that we are trying to keep out of scope of our discussion how the PCAOB may be able to use AI in its oversight responsibilities. We acknowledge that that is an important topic, but we're not going to focus on that in our discussions today. Next slide, please. So we have 4 breakout groups that are going to focus on different topics. And I think that, I guess the PCAOB will tell us how we're going to get into those breakout sessions. But the first group is going to focus more on the preparation of financial statements. What are the risks? What makes the AI reliable? And what the future opportunities are. And David Fabricant will be leading that discussion and reporting back to the full SEAG. The second group will be discussing how auditors are using AI in auditing, what the risks are, how they determine whether it's reliable, and the potential future opportunities. That discussion group will be led by Brian Croteau. And then in group 3, we will be discussing how does one consider potential fraud risks from AI, which can be used to create fake content. What reliable audit evidence can we get in the wake of this possibility? And could we use actually AI to detect fraud? This discussion group will be led by me. And then the final discussion group will focus on whether the auditor should describe or provide any disclosure to the audit committee or to the public in their audit reports about auditing AI outputs, the use of AI in auditing, or other risks. That will be led jointly by Dane Mott and Jim Hunt. Thank you.
So Brian, do you want to, we're going to go into a break here, but Brian, do you want to let everyone know the process for being pushed into the breakout rooms?
Yes. So I will end the public portion here, and we'll go backstage and we'll discuss how the breakout rooms will work.